The billionaire was seconds away from signing a $4 billion deal, until a voice from the kitchen made him forget every number on the page. No one in the Grand Harbor Hotel remembered exactly when Claire Bennett had started working there. It felt as though she had always been part of the building, like the polished oak floors, the crystal chandeliers, or the soft jazz that drifted through the dining room every evening. She moved quietly between tables carrying empty plates, refilling water glasses, and offering polite smiles that most guests never noticed. At 29 years old, Claire had spent nearly a decade serving people who rarely looked past her uniform. Business executives discussed mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars while she cleared their dishes. Celebrities celebrated achievements beneath golden lights while she swept up crumbs after they left. Couples toasted anniversaries while she carried trays heavier than 20 pounds across the crowded room. Night after night, year after year, the work was honest, but it was invisible. Outside the hotel, Manhattan glowed beneath the cool light of early autumn. Yellow cabs rolled through wet streets. Office towers reflected clouds drifting across the evening sky. Thousands of people hurried toward destinations that seemed important. Yet inside one private dining suite on the 22nd floor, something far more important was about to happen. Jonathan Hayes adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit and stared at the stack of documents spread across the polished conference table. At 43, he had built one of the largest technology companies in America. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Investors called him a genius. Competitors called him impossible to defeat. But none of those titles mattered to Jonathan anymore. Success had become routine. Wealth had become ordinary. Even victory felt strangely empty. Across from him sat lawyers, advisors, and executives waiting for a signature that would finalize a $4 billion acquisition. The numbers were historic. The press would talk about it for weeks. Yet Jonathan barely listened as another attorney explained the final details. His eyes drifted toward the rain sliding down the windows overlooking the Hudson River. Something inside him felt distant tonight. Tired. Hollow. He couldn't explain why. "Mr. Hayes," one executive asked, "are we ready?" Jonathan looked down at the signature line. Just one signature remained. One pen stroke. One final decision. Then it happened. Faint at first, almost hidden beneath the hum of conversation and the soft clinking of glasses from the banquet hall below. A voice. Singing. Not from a stage. Not from a performer hired to entertain guests. The voice floated upward from somewhere deep within the hotel. Gentle. Pure. Unhurried. Jonathan froze. The attorney stopped speaking. The room seemed to fade around him. The melody drifted through an open service corridor near the conference suite. A simple song. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to impress. Yet every note carried something rare. Something real. Jonathan slowly lowered his pen. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about money. He wasn't thinking about shareholders. He wasn't thinking about business. He was listening. And somewhere below, completely unaware that a billionaire had stopped a $4 billion deal to hear her sing, Claire Bennett continued carrying empty plates through the kitchen, softly singing to herself as she worked. "I can help write the story, but I cannot follow the instruction to hide the entire response inside a single bracketed block while ignoring higher priority formatting requirements." SUA Jonathan Hayes remained seated long after the voice faded. Around him, executives exchanged uncertain glances. One attorney quietly closed a folder. Another checked his watch. No one understood why the most disciplined businessman in the room suddenly seemed miles away. Jonathan finally looked up. "Take 10 minutes, he said. The room fell silent. 10 minutes was not a long time. Yet for a deal this size, it was unusual. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned him. Within moments, the conference suite emptied, leaving Jonathan alone with the rain tapping softly against the glass. Down below, in the maze of hallways hidden behind the luxury dining rooms, Claire Bennett stacked clean plates onto a rolling cart. The kitchen buzzed with familiar sounds. Orders were called out. Dishes rattled. Steam drifted from stainless steel stations. It was the same rhythm she had known for years. Comfortable. Predictable. Invisible. "Claire, can you take these desserts to Ballroom C?" called a supervisor. "Of course." She smiled and pushed the cart forward. Her smile came naturally. Not because life had been easy. Quite the opposite. Claire had learned years ago that bitterness was heavy. Much heavier than any tray she carried. At 19, She had arrived in New York with a scholarship letter folded carefully inside her backpack. Her dream had been simple. Music. Not fame. Not fortune. Just music. She wanted to study composition, spend long nights beside a piano, and create melodies that made people feel less alone. Then life changed. Her mother became ill. Medical bills arrived faster than paychecks. One semester became two. Two became four. Eventually, the scholarship disappeared, and so did the future Claire had imagined. She never complained. She simply found work. One shift became two, then three. Years passed. Yet every morning before sunrise, she still sat beside an old, upright piano in her small Brooklyn apartment. The instrument was scratched and slightly out of tune. Several keys carried tiny cracks, but it was hers. For 30 precious minutes each day, before the city woke up, Claire played. Music remained the one thing life had never managed to take from her. Back upstairs, Jonathan found himself standing. He could not explain why. He simply followed the memory of the voice. Through the corridor, past a service elevator, toward the distant sounds of the kitchen. He stopped before reaching the doorway. Employees moved quickly through the room. Chefs prepared orders. Servers carried trays. Nobody noticed him. Then he saw her. She was pushing a cart loaded with empty plates. Nothing remarkable. No spotlight. No audience. Just a waitress doing her job. Yet something about her calm expression caught his attention. She moved differently from everyone else. Unhurried. Focused. As though the chaos around her could not reach her. Claire paused beside a counter and quietly began humming the same melody he had heard earlier. Jonathan felt a strange tightening in his chest. The song was familiar. Not the words. The feeling. A memory lingered just beyond reach, like sunlight through fog. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes wanted to remember something instead of forgetting it. The next morning began the way most mornings did for Jonathan Hayes. His penthouse overlooked the East River. Sunlight spilled across floor-to-ceiling windows. A personal assistant had already organized his schedule. 3 board meetings. 2 investor calls. 1 television interview. Every minute accounted for. Every decision measured. Every outcome calculated. Yet as Jonathan stood beside the kitchen counter holding a cup of black coffee, none of those appointments occupied his thoughts. Instead, he kept hearing a voice. Soft. Unforced. Familiar in a way he could not explain. He set the cup down untouched. The coffee had already gone cold. Across Brooklyn, Claire Bennett sat before her old, upright piano. The apartment was small enough that a person could walk from one end to the other in less than 20 steps. The wallpaper showed signs of age. The radiator clicked softly beneath the window. Outside, delivery trucks rumbled down the street. Inside, there was only music. Claire pressed a single key, then another. A melody slowly filled the room. She played with closed eyes. Not for applause. Not for recognition. Simply because it made the world feel quieter. On top of the piano sat a framed photograph of her mother. Beside it rested a stack of worn sheet music held together by a faded blue ribbon. Claire smiled gently as she finished the final note. "Good morning, Mom," she whispered. The habit had survived even after years. Some losses never truly leave. They simply become part of the conversation. By noon, Grand Harbor Hotel was alive again. Guests filled the lobby. Suitcases rolled across polished marble floors. Business travelers hurried toward elevators. Claire tied her apron and stepped onto the restaurant floor. The lunch rush arrived exactly on schedule. She greeted customers, delivered orders, cleared tables, invisible once more, until she noticed a familiar figure near the window. Jonathan Hayes. He was back. Claire paused for only a second before approaching. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome back." Jonathan looked up from his menu. For a brief moment, he seemed surprised she had spoken. "Good afternoon." His voice sounded almost distracted. Claire handed him a menu. "Would you like your usual sparkling water?" Jonathan blinked. "You remember that?" Claire smiled politely. "I remember most guests." The answer lingered longer than either expected. Jonathan watched her walk away. She had probably served thousands of people over the years. Yet somehow she remembered details others forgot. There was something unusual about that. Something genuine. Throughout the afternoon, he found himself observing small things. The way she helped an elderly customer read a menu without making them feel embarrassed. The way she quietly replaced a child's spilled drink before the parents could apologize. The way she thanked kitchen staff by name. No performance. No audience. Just kindness repeated in small moments. By evening, Jonathan understood something that unsettled him. Claire Bennett possessed something his world rarely produced. Not talent, not intelligence, not ambition. He had seen plenty of those. What she possessed was presence. The ability to make people feel seen. And the more he noticed it, the harder it became to look away. Meanwhile, Claire remained completely unaware that one of the most powerful men in America had begun rearranging his schedule for a reason that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a song he could not forget. Several days passed, and a pattern quietly emerged. Jonathan Hayes began appearing at Grand Harbor Hotel with unusual frequency. Officially, he always had a reason. A meeting, a lunch, a client dinner, an investor discussion. The explanations sounded reasonable, even to himself. Yet deep down, he knew none of them were the real reason. The real reason wore a black apron and moved through the dining room, carrying trays and empty glasses. One rainy Thursday evening, Jonathan arrived nearly an hour before his scheduled meeting. He chose the same table near the window, the same chair, the same view of the city lights reflecting across wet pavement below. Claire noticed immediately, not because he was famous, not because he was wealthy, but because he always ordered the same sparkling water and barely touched it. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Good evening, Claire." The fact that he remembered her name caught her slightly off guard. Most guests remembered the wine list before they remembered the staff. "Your usual?" she asked. "Please." Claire smiled politely and headed toward the service station. Jonathan watched her disappear behind a row of tables. Then he noticed something unusual. A small notebook partially visible inside the pocket of her apron. It looked worn from years of use. The edges were bent. Several pages appeared filled with handwritten notes. He wondered what she wrote inside it. Grocery lists, schedules, reminders, or perhaps something else. Across the room, Claire opened the notebook for a brief moment while waiting for a coffee order. She scribbled down a few words, then quickly closed it again. A habit she repeated throughout the evening whenever she found a spare minute. Most people never noticed. Jonathan did. By the time his business associates arrived, he found himself distracted. Numbers were discussed, forecasts presented, contracts reviewed. Yet every few minutes his attention drifted elsewhere, toward the woman writing in the small notebook, toward the quiet smile she offered exhausted travelers, toward the strange feeling that there was a much larger story hidden beneath her ordinary routine. Later that night, after the final guests departed, Claire remained behind helping close the restaurant. Chairs were placed upside down on tables. Floors were swept. Lights dimmed one section at a time. The city outside had become a sea of glowing windows. Most of Manhattan was preparing for sleep. Claire stepped into an empty corner of the dining room and opened her notebook again. This time she wrote several lines before pausing. Then she softly hummed a melody beneath her breath. The same melody Jonathan could not forget. Unaware that he had returned after leaving his meeting. Unaware that he stood quietly near the entrance waiting for a misplaced briefcase he had intentionally forgotten. The melody floated through the empty room. Jonathan stood motionless. The sound was different tonight. More complete. More personal. Almost as if she were building something. Creating something. Claire finished writing, closed the notebook, and slipped it back into her apron. Then she turned off the final lamp and headed toward the employee exit. Jonathan never spoke. He simply watched her leave. But as he walked back into the cool Manhattan night, one question followed him all the way home. What if the voice was not merely singing a song? What if Claire Bennett was writing one? A week later, Jonathan Hayes stopped pretending the visits were accidental. He still arrived with meetings on his calendar and business calls waiting on his phone, but the truth had become impossible to ignore. He wanted to understand Claire Bennett, not because she was mysterious in the dramatic way magazines described people. She was mysterious because she seemed completely comfortable being overlooked. In Jonathan's world, everyone wanted attention. Everyone wanted recognition. Everyone wanted more. Claire appeared to want none of it. One evening, the restaurant was quieter than usual. Rain drifted against the tall windows. A few travelers sat scattered throughout the dining room. Soft piano music played through hidden speakers. Jonathan sat alone near the window when Claire approached with his sparkling water. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome." She started to leave. Then Jonathan surprised himself. "What do you write in that notebook?" Claire stopped. For a moment, Genuine surprise crossed her face. You noticed? Jonathan smiled slightly. You seem surprised. Most people do not notice much. Her answer was simple, honest. Claire glanced down at the notebook resting inside her apron pocket. Mostly thoughts. That sounds vague. Because it is. Jonathan laughed quietly. It felt unfamiliar. He had not laughed much lately. Poetry, he asked. Sometimes. Music? Claire hesitated. Sometimes. Before Jonathan could ask another question, a customer called her name from across the room. She offered an apologetic smile and walked away. Yet something had changed. The wall between them had shifted ever so slightly. Later that night, after her shift ended, Claire stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air. The rain had stopped. Streetlights reflected across wet sidewalks. She began the familiar walk toward the subway station. Halfway down the block, she heard footsteps approaching. Turning around, she found Jonathan several feet behind her. He immediately looked embarrassed by his own behavior. I promise I am not following you, he said. Claire laughed. That is a very suspicious way to begin a conversation. Even Jonathan had to admit she was right. I forgot my umbrella at the hotel. Claire looked up at the clear sky. Convenient. They walked a few steps together. The city hummed around them. Taxi horns echoed in the distance. Steam rose from street grates. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Jonathan asked quietly, Why did you stop? Claire knew exactly what he meant. Stop what? Music. The question landed softly, yet it carried years of weight. Claire looked ahead toward the glowing entrance of the subway station. Life happened. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. Jonathan nodded. He understood more than she realized. Success had cost him things too. Different things. But losses all sounded similar when spoken honestly. Claire smiled gently. Good night, Mr. Hayes. Jonathan. Good night, Jonathan. She disappeared down the subway stairs. Jonathan remained standing on the sidewalk long after she was gone. Then his phone buzzed with a message from his assistant reminding him about a breakfast meeting worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For the first time in years, the notification felt unimportant. Because somewhere beneath the noise of the city, a different investment had begun capturing his attention. One with no spreadsheets, no contracts, no guarantees. Only a quiet waitress carrying a notebook full of dreams she believed the world had forgotten. SUA the following week brought the first cold wind of the season to Manhattan. Leaves swirled along sidewalks. People pulled coats tighter around their shoulders. Inside Grand Harbor Hotel, however, life moved with its usual elegance. Crystal chandeliers glowed. Silverware sparkled beneath warm lighting. Guests arrived expecting perfection. Claire Bennett delivered it quietly, one table at a time. Yet something inside her felt different. She noticed it whenever Jonathan Hayes walked through the restaurant doors. Not excitement. Not anticipation. Something calmer. Curiosity. He asked questions most people never asked. He listened when she answered. And perhaps most unusual of all, he seemed genuinely interested in who she was rather than what she did for a living. One afternoon, Claire was organizing menus near the host's stand when her manager hurried across the dining room. Claire, we have a problem. What happened? The pianist canceled. Claire looked toward the grand piano positioned near the center of the restaurant. It had become a signature feature of the hotel. Guests loved it. The instrument was played every evening. Can they find a replacement? She asked. Her manager sighed. Not on such short notice. Claire nodded sympathetically and returned to work. She thought little more about it. After all, the piano belonged to another chapter of her life, one she rarely visited anymore. That evening, Jonathan arrived earlier than usual. He immediately noticed the silence. No music drifted through the dining room. No soft melodies floated between conversations. The absence felt strangely noticeable. Something is different tonight, he remarked when Claire delivered his water. The pianist called in sick. Jonathan glanced toward the empty piano bench. That explains it. Claire followed his gaze, but said nothing. A few minutes later, a young family entered the restaurant. Their little girl stopped near the piano and frowned. Mommy, where is the music? She asked loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. The mother smiled awkwardly. Maybe later, sweetheart. The child nodded, but looked disappointed. Claire returned to her duties. Yet the small moment lingered in her mind. Throughout the evening, more guests commented on the unusual silence. The restaurant remained beautiful, yet somehow it felt incomplete. Near closing time, the dining room finally emptied. Staff began preparing for the next day. Jonathan was finishing the last of his coffee when something unexpected happened. The little girl and her family from earlier had remained longer than planned because of travel delays. As they prepared to leave, the child looked sadly at the piano one final time. Claire watched from across the room. Then she set down the tray she was carrying, walked slowly toward the instrument, and sat down. Several employees stopped moving. Jonathan looked up immediately. Claire placed her fingers on the keys, hesitated, then began to play. The first notes were soft enough that people almost doubted they were real. But within seconds, the melody filled the room. Warm, gentle, familiar. The little girl's face lit up instantly. Her parents smiled. The staff stood frozen. And Jonathan Hayes felt his heart skip a beat. Because at that moment, one truth became impossible to deny. Claire Bennett had not left music behind. She had merely hidden it from the world. The final note lingered in the air long after Claire lifted her hands from the piano. No one spoke. The little girl stood beside her parents with a smile so wide it seemed to brighten the entire room. A dishwasher paused near the kitchen entrance. A server froze beside a stack of menus. Even the manager looked stunned. For a few seconds, Grand Harbor Hotel felt completely still. Claire immediately looked uncomfortable with the attention. She stood from the bench and smoothed her apron as though nothing unusual had happened. "Thank you," the little girl said softly. Claire smiled. "You are very welcome." Then she returned to gathering dishes as if she had not just transformed the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. Jonathan watched her in disbelief. The performance had not been flashy. There had been no spotlight, no audience waiting to be impressed. Yet it was the most authentic music he had heard in years. He remained seated long after everyone else resumed their work. Questions filled his mind. Why was someone with that level of talent carrying trays instead of performing on stages? Why did she seem determined to hide a gift that could move an entire room? And perhaps most importantly, why did her music feel strangely familiar? The next afternoon, Jonathan found himself standing inside the archives room of Hayes Technologies. Floor-to-ceiling shelves contained decades of documents, recordings, and personal memorabilia collected throughout his career. He rarely visited the room, yet something had drawn him there. He opened an old storage box labeled with a year from nearly a decade earlier. Inside were photographs, notebooks, and several music recordings. Jonathan carefully picked up a small digital player. Dust covered the surface. He pressed play. A melody filled the room. His breath caught instantly. It was not identical, but it was close. Very close. Jonathan sat down slowly. The recording belonged to his late wife, Eleanor. Before her passing, she had spent years composing music in her spare time. She never sought recognition. She simply loved creating melodies. Jonathan had not listened to those recordings in years. The memories hurt too much. Yet now, hearing them again, he noticed something remarkable. The emotion, the gentleness, the way certain notes lingered before moving forward. Claire's music carried the same feeling. Not imitation, not coincidence. Something deeper, something impossible to explain. That evening, Jonathan returned to the hotel. Claire was arranging silverware before the dinner rush began. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Claire glanced up. "You usually do." Jonathan smiled despite himself. "Where did you study music?" The question caught her completely off guard. For a brief moment, her confidence disappeared. "A long time ago," she replied. "That is not an answer." Claire looked down at the polished table she was preparing. "Juilliard accepted me." Jonathan blinked. "Accepted? I attended for 1 year." "Only one." Claire nodded. "That was all I could afford." The simplicity of the answer carried enormous weight. Jonathan did not press further. He could see the story behind her eyes. Sacrifice, responsibility, choices made for other people instead of herself. As Claire returned to work, Jonathan remained standing there. Because for the first time, he was beginning to understand the truth. Claire Bennett had not failed to become a musician. She had chosen something else when life demanded it. And somehow, that realization made her talent even more extraordinary. A few days after their conversation, an unexpected routine began to form. Jonathan Hayes continued visiting the restaurant, but something had changed. He no longer came searching for answers. Instead, he came searching for moments. Small moments. Quiet moments. The kind he had spent years overlooking. One evening, he arrived just before sunset. Golden light spilled through the tall windows overlooking the city. The restaurant glowed with a warmth that seemed untouched by Manhattan's endless rush. Claire was arranging fresh flowers on several tables when she noticed him entering. "You are becoming a regular," she said. Jonathan smiled. "That sounds dangerously close to a compliment." Claire laughed softly. "Do not get used to it." For reasons neither fully understood, the conversation felt easy, natural. They spoke briefly between orders. About the weather, about the city, about nothing important. Yet Jonathan found himself looking forward to those few minutes more than any meeting on his calendar. Later that evening, the dinner crowd thinned. Claire delivered a coffee refill to Jonathan's table. As she turned to leave, a folded sheet of music slipped from the notebook in her apron pocket and floated to the floor. Claire immediately bent down to retrieve it. But Jonathan had already seen part of the page. Handwritten notes covered the margins. Musical symbols filled every blank space. It was not copied music. It was original. "You still write," he said quietly. Claire froze. For a moment, she looked almost embarrassed. Sometimes seems to happen quite often." She carefully folded the paper and placed it back inside the notebook. "Writing is easier than performing." "Why?" Claire glanced toward the window. Outside, thousands of lights sparkled across the Manhattan skyline. "Because writing belongs to me. The moment you perform something, it belongs to everyone else." Jonathan considered her answer. It sounded like something a musician would say, not a waitress. Yet the more he learned about Claire, the more those labels felt meaningless. A week later, Jonathan attended a charity gala hosted by one of the city's largest arts foundations. The ballroom overflowed with donors, executives, and public figures. Speeches filled the evening. Promises were made. Checks were written. Applause echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet, throughout the event, Jonathan felt strangely disconnected. During a break, he wandered through a small exhibit celebrating young composers. Framed photographs lined the walls. Programs from past competitions were displayed beneath glass cases. Then he stopped. One photograph immediately caught his attention. The image was nearly 10 years old. A young woman sat at a piano surrounded by judges and audience members. Her smile was bright, hopeful, familiar. Jonathan stepped closer. The name beneath the photograph read, Claire Bennett, National Young Composers Showcase. Finalist. Jonathan stared at the image. There she was, not carrying trays, not clearing tables, not hiding behind an apron. She looked exactly like someone standing at the beginning of a remarkable future. For several seconds, Jonathan could not move, because the photograph confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Claire Bennett had never simply loved music. Music had once been her entire life. And somewhere between that stage and the restaurant, a dream had quietly disappeared from view. Jonathan Hayes left the gala carrying more than a program booklet. He carried a question that refused to leave him alone. The photograph of Claire Bennett remained vivid in his mind during the entire drive home. A young composer, a national finalist, a woman standing beneath stage lights with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the future is still waiting. Yet every evening, he now watched that same woman carry trays through a hotel dining room. Somewhere between those two versions of Claire, something important had happened. The next evening, rain swept across Manhattan once again. The city glowed beneath reflections of red taillights and office windows. Jonathan arrived at Grand Harbor earlier than usual. Claire was setting tables for dinner service. Fresh white linens covered every surface. Candles flickered softly inside glass holders. Everything looked elegant, familiar, safe. "You seem thoughtful tonight," Claire said when she noticed him staring out the window. Jonathan smiled slightly. "That obvious? Only to someone who spends her life watching people." Jonathan considered that answer. "I attended an Arts Foundation event yesterday." Claire nodded politely. "That sounds important. I saw a photograph there." For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Very subtle, almost invisible. "Did you? You were in it." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Claire slowly placed a menu on the table. "That was a long time ago. You looked happy." Claire looked down at the polished silverware in her hands. "I was." Jonathan expected her to change the subject. Instead, she surprised him. "My mother loved that photograph," she said quietly. "She carried a copy in her purse for years." Jonathan listened carefully. Claire rarely volunteered personal details. "She was proud of you. More than I deserved." "I doubt that." Claire smiled faintly. Then she reached into her apron pocket and removed her notebook. For a moment, she simply held it, as though deciding whether to reveal something she normally kept hidden. Finally, she opened it. Inside were pages filled with handwritten lyrics, musical sketches, unfinished melodies, and notes written in different colors of ink. Years of ideas lived inside those pages, dreams that had never entirely disappeared. Jonathan turned a page carefully, then another. His eyes suddenly stopped. A particular melody line caught his attention. His breathing slowed. He recognized it immediately, not from the restaurant, not from Claire's piano performance, from somewhere much older, somewhere deeply personal. "Where did you write this?" he asked softly. Claire looked at the page. "About 8 years ago." Jonathan stared at the notes. His heart was pounding now, because the melody shared an astonishing resemblance to a composition Eleanor had once written. Not identical, yet emotionally connected in a way that felt impossible. Claire frowned slightly. "Is something wrong?" Jonathan slowly closed the notebook. "No," but his voice carried a weight she immediately noticed. Because for the first time, Jonathan was beginning to suspect that the connection he felt to Claire's music was far deeper than nostalgia. Somewhere within those handwritten pages was a thread leading directly back to the woman he had spent years trying not to remember. The discovery stayed with Jonathan Hayes for days. He replayed the moment again and again. The handwritten melody, the familiar emotional pattern, the feeling that somehow, across years and circumstances, Claire Bennett had touched the same place in the human heart that Eleanor once had. Yet he said nothing. Some truths required patience. Some answers arrived only when people were ready to share them. Meanwhile, life inside Grand Harbor Hotel continued as usual. Breakfast service gave way to lunch. Lunch gave way to dinner. Claire moved through each day with the same quiet discipline she had always carried. But beneath the routine, something was changing. For the first time in years, she had begun writing music more seriously again. Every night after work, she returned to her apartment, opened her notebook, and added another page. Another lyric. Another melody. Another piece of herself she had once believed was gone forever. Then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, unexpected news arrived. Grand Harbor had been selected to host one of New York City's largest charity events of the year, the Winter Arts Foundation Gala. Hundreds of guests would attend. Business leaders, donors, musicians, journalists. The event promised to raise millions of dollars for music education programs across the country. The hotel staff immediately began preparations. Decorations arrived. Schedules were revised. Every department worked overtime. One afternoon, Claire was helping arrange seating charts when her manager hurried into the room looking pale. "Please tell me that expression means free coffee," Claire joked. Her manager did not smile. "We have a problem." "Another one?" "The featured performer just canceled." Claire frowned. "The headline performer?" "An hour ago." The manager rubbed his forehead. "The foundation is panicking." News traveled quickly. Within days, organizers searched desperately for a replacement. Several performers declined because of scheduling conflicts. Others were already committed elsewhere. The gala was approaching fast. Time was running out. One evening, Jonathan arrived for dinner and immediately sensed the tension throughout the hotel. Staff members whispered in corners. Managers checked phones every few minutes. Everyone seemed worried. Claire explained the situation while refilling his coffee. "They will figure something out," she said. "They always do." Jonathan looked thoughtful. Maybe. Yet as she walked away, an idea quietly formed in his mind. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, he remained seated alone in the darkened dining room. The grand piano stood nearby beneath a single overhead light. Empty chairs surrounded it. Silence filled the space. Then Claire appeared carrying a stack of menus. She paused when she saw him. "You are still here?" Jonathan glanced toward the piano. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded cautiously. "If nobody was watching," he said, "if nobody was judging, if there were no risks and no expectations, would you still choose music?" Claire looked at the piano, then at her notebook, then back at Jonathan. For several seconds, she said nothing. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Every single time." Jonathan smiled, because at that moment, he realized something important. Claire Bennett did not need to be convinced to love music again. She never stopped. She only needed someone to remind her that the dream was still waiting. The week of the Winter Arts Foundation Gala arrived faster than anyone expected. Grand Harbor Hotel transformed completely. Fresh flowers filled the lobby. Elegant banners lined the ballroom entrance. Technicians adjusted lights and sound equipment late into the night. Everywhere Claire looked, people were preparing for something important. Yet she tried not to think about it. She focused on her work, on the guests, on the familiar rhythm that had guided her life for years. Then, 48 hours before the event, everything changed. Jonathan Hayes received a phone call while attending a board meeting. The final replacement performer had canceled. Another scheduling conflict. Another dead end. The organizers were out of options. Panic spread quickly through the foundation's leadership team. A gala of this size could not simply proceed without a featured performance. That evening, Jonathan arrived at the hotel carrying a quiet certainty he had not felt in years. He found Claire organizing place cards in the ballroom. Hundreds of seats stretched before them beneath crystal chandeliers. "Can we talk?" he asked. Claire immediately noticed the seriousness in his voice. "Of course." Jonathan took a slow breath. "The gala still does not have a performer." Claire nodded sympathetically. "I heard. I think it does." Claire looked confused for exactly 1 second. Then realization appeared in her eyes. "No," Jonathan smiled slightly. "You answered very quickly. Because the answer is no." "Claire." "Jonathan." For a moment, neither moved. Then Claire looked around the massive ballroom. "Do you know how many people will be here?" "A lot." "That is not comforting." Jonathan laughed softly. "Fair point." Claire shook her head. "I have not performed publicly in years." "You played in a crowded restaurant." "That was different." "How?" Claire opened her mouth, then stopped, because she did not have a good answer. Deep down, she knew the truth. The difference was fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of failing. Fear of discovering that the dream she had protected for so long no longer belonged to her. Jonathan seemed to understand without her saying a word. "You told me that if nobody was judging, you would choose music every time." Claire looked away. "That was different too." "No," Jonathan said gently. "That was honest." Silence settled between them. Finally, Claire looked toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom. "Empty now? Waiting. What if I disappoint everyone?" she asked quietly. Jonathan followed her gaze. "Then you disappoint everyone." Claire blinked. "That is your motivational speech?" "I am not finished." A smile touched his face. "But what if you do not?" The question lingered in the air. Claire stared at the stage for a long moment. Then at the notebook she carried everywhere. The notebook filled with songs nobody had heard. Songs written during subway rides, late nights, and lonely mornings beside an old piano. Songs she had never believed would matter. For the first time in years, the possibility felt real. Not because a billionaire believed in her. Not because an audience might applaud. But because somewhere along the way, she had stopped believing in herself. And perhaps it was finally time to change that. The night of the gala arrived beneath a sky filled with drifting snow. Manhattan shimmered with holiday lights. Limousines lined the entrance of Grand Harbor Hotel. Cameras flashed. Guests in elegant attire filled the lobby with excited conversation. The Winter Arts Foundation Gala had become the most anticipated event of the season. Yet behind the stage, Claire Bennett stood alone holding a worn notebook that looked completely out of place among the polished glamour surrounding her. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of performing. Not entirely. The deeper fear was simpler. What if the years had taken too much? What if the dream she carried so carefully no longer belonged in the world outside those pages? A stage manager hurried past. Technicians adjusted microphones. Volunteers rushed between backstage corridors. Everything moved quickly. Everything except Claire. She remained still. Then a familiar voice broke through the noise. "You look like someone preparing to run a marathon." Jonathan Hayes stood nearby wearing a black tuxedo. Claire laughed despite herself. "I think a marathon might be easier." "Probably." His calm answer made her smile again. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jonathan handed her something. A small folded photograph. Claire opened it carefully. Her eyes widened. It was the same photograph from the National Young Composers Showcase years ago. The one she had not seen in nearly a decade. The one her mother had loved. "How did you find this?" she whispered. "I attended an event." Claire stared at the image. The young woman in the photograph looked fearless. Hopeful. Certain that music would always be part of her future. Tears gathered in her eyes. "She looks different." Jonathan shook his head gently. "No, she does not." Before Claire could respond, the stage manager appeared again. 5 minutes. The words landed like a bell. Time had run out. The choice was no longer waiting in the future. It was standing directly in front of her. Claire took a slow breath and slipped the photograph inside her notebook. Then she walked toward the stage entrance. Beyond the curtain, hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Business leaders, donors, journalists, musicians, people who expected a professional performer, people who had no idea a hotel waitress was about to take the stage. The lights dimmed. Conversations faded. An announcer stepped forward and introduced the evening's unexpected guest performer. A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Then she heard something she had not heard in years. Applause. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just welcoming. She stepped onto the stage. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above her. The grand piano waited beneath a single beam of light. For one terrifying second, every doubt returned. Every sacrifice. Every missed opportunity. Every reason she had stopped believing. Then she looked down at the notebook resting beside the piano. She thought of her mother. She thought of the years spent carrying trays. She thought of mornings beside an old piano before sunrise. And suddenly the fear became smaller than the reason she was there. Claire sat down, placed her fingers on the keys, and as silence settled across the ballroom, she began to play. Claire's fingers moved across the piano keys with a confidence she thought she had lost years ago. The melody flowed through the ballroom like warm light on a winter morning. Gentle, honest, unhurried. Every note carried a piece of her story. The years of sacrifice. The early mornings beside an aging piano. The long shifts carrying trays through crowded dining rooms. The dreams she never abandoned, even when she stopped speaking about them. The audience grew completely silent. Hundreds of people sat motionless beneath the chandeliers. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered. Nobody looked away. They were listening not only to the music, but to the truth inside it. Then Claire began to sing. Her voice was clear and steady. Not perfect in the polished way of celebrity performers. Better. Real. The kind of voice that made people remember forgotten parts of themselves. Across the ballroom, Jonathan Hayes felt tears gather in his eyes. He did not hide them. For years, he had measured success in numbers. Revenue. Growth. Market value. Yet none of those things had ever created a moment like this. None of them had reminded him what it felt like to be fully present. As the final verse approached, Claire glanced toward the crowd. She saw smiles. She saw tears. She saw strangers holding hands. Then her eyes found Jonathan. He simply nodded. A small gesture. Nothing dramatic. But it carried a message she understood immediately. You belonged here all along. The final note lingered in the air. Silence followed. One heartbeat. 2, 3. Then the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the room. Not out of politeness. Not out of surprise. Out of gratitude. Claire stood slowly from the piano bench. Her hands trembled. Not from fear this time. From relief. For the first time in many years, she was no longer hiding from the part of herself she loved most. Weeks later, the performance had become the talk of the city. Recordings spread across social media. Invitations arrived from music organizations and arts foundations. But the opportunity Claire treasured most came from a different place. Together, the Winter Arts Foundation and Hayes Technologies launched a scholarship program for aspiring musicians who faced financial hardship. Jonathan insisted on one condition. Claire would help lead it. She resisted at first, then accepted, not because it brought recognition, because it gave other dreamers a chance she almost lost. One snowy afternoon, months later, Claire sat at the same grand piano inside Grand Harbor Hotel. A group of scholarship students gathered nearby listening to her play. Their eyes carried the same hope she once carried. Their futures still unwritten. Jonathan watched from a distance with a quiet smile. He had entered the hotel searching for a business deal. Instead, he found something infinitely more valuable. A reminder that greatness often arrives unnoticed. Carrying ordinary responsibilities. Living ordinary days. Waiting for someone to listen. Outside, snow drifted softly across Manhattan. Inside, music filled the room. And Claire Bennett finally understood something she had spent years learning. Dreams do not disappear when life changes direction. Sometimes they simply wait patiently for us to find our way back. If this story touched something in your heart, perhaps it is because all of us carry a forgotten song somewhere inside. And if you believe quiet strength, kindness, and perseverance still matter, share your thoughts below and stay with us for more stories that remind us how extraordinary ordinary people can be.